According to Norse mythology, in ancient times, the dwarf craftsman Brokkr was tricked into making a bet by Loki. You'll remember from the last lecture that Loki had cut off the goddess Sif's beautiful hair, and that Odin had demanded that Loki restore it somehow. Loki had sought out the craftsman to obtain silken golden thread to fashion new hair for Sif, and as usual, Loki engaged in some manipulation. Loki declared that Brokkr's brother, the dwarf craftsman Sindri, could not forge anything more wondrous than items made by other dwarves, the dwarf sons of Ivaldi. The sons of Ivaldi had fashioned Skidbladnir, the swift ship belonging to the god Freyr, and Gungnir, the powerful spear of Odin, as well as the threads of gold woven into hair for the goddess Sif. Brokkr was suckered into the bet, and he wagered his own head that his brother Sindri could make items even more impressive than the ship, the spear, or Sif's golden hair. Loki accepted the bet, wagering his own head in return. They agreed that the gods themselves would judge the dwarf's work. When Brokkr told his brother Sindri about the bet, Sindri became nervous. The ship, the sword, and Sif's hair were beyond special. They were truly wondrous. At first, Sindri made a golden boar who could fly through the air and whose golden bristles cast light as it flew. Brokkr was confident that the magic boar outshone the items that the sons of Ivaldi had made, but Sindri wasn't so sure, so he decided to make something else in addition. Next, Sindri made a golden arm ring for Odin. Every 9th day, because of the importance of the number 9 in Norse thought, the ring would drip 8 more golden arm rings. Sindri named this ring Draupnir, meaning the dripper, because it dripped rings of gold. Again, Brokkr was confident that this item outshone the items made by the dwarf sons of Ivaldi, but Sindri decided to make one thing more. Finally, Sindri made a great hammer. This was the hammer Mjolnir, which had a shortened handle but could not be destroyed. And this time, Sindri was satisfied with his works. The golden boar was given to Freyr, the hammer was given to Thor, and Draupnir, the arm ring, was given to Odin. The gods declared that Sindri had won the bet, and Brokkr turned to the trickster figure Loki, demanding his head. Loki leaned over, and Brokkr prepared his sword to strike, but at the last moment, Loki surprised him. "I promised to yield my head," Loki declared, "but I promised not 1 square inch of my neck. So take my head off if you can, but leave all of my neck." Faced with this impossible requirement, Brokkr, of course, became enraged, and he turned to the gods to help him. But Odin declared that Loki, even if he had been deceitful, had bested Brokkr in this bet. As a last resort, Brokkr asked to be able to sew Loki's lips together so that he could not lie or deceive with his words any longer. Odin granted this wish, and Brokkr sewed Loki's lips together, silencing him for a time. This is one of my favorite Norse stories. It captures the personalities of certain gods and dwarves, but it also highlights the importance of special items in Norse mythology. Carefully crafted items recognized as powerful or magical or significant in some way. Many of the gods' possessions have names and stories behind them, as well as magical powers. Norse mythology isn't alone here. The Greeks and the Romans and the Celts all tell stories of powerful objects, usually associated with the gods or great heroes. This is true of myths in other cultures as well. In Norse mythology, magical items don't belong to ordinary people. They are the prized possessions of great kings, warriors, and heroes. Skidbladnir, for example, is a ship big enough for all the gods to travel in together, yet it can be folded up small enough to put into a pocket, like a napkin, according to the tradition. It always finds a good wind, and it brings its passengers safely to their destination. No mere mortal deserves this ship. Freyr, the god associated with kingship and with fair weather, stewards this boat. Similarly, Gungnir, the strongest and truest spear, is given to Odin. This spear will always hit its mark, no matter who throws it, so it needs to be in the hands of an honest, just god like Odin. Draupnir, the magical golden arm ring, is a bit different. Unlike Freyr's ship or Odin's spear or Thor's hammer, Draupnir doesn't have an obvious practical use. There's no story in which Draupnir helps anyone achieve a momentous goal or accomplish a demanding task. Instead, Draupnir is more of a status symbol, beautiful to look at, dropping rings of gold every 9 days. Draupnir is a treasure, a gift to be cherished and then passed on. The story of Draupnir is an extended story in Norse mythology. Odin wears the arm ring for many years. Then his son Baldur is killed, even though he was supposed to be invincible. One Norse tradition describes Baldur as a noble and brave warrior who, because of protective magic, couldn't be killed with any weapon. However, Loki found out that Baldur was vulnerable to one living thing, mistletoe. Loki fashioned a spear from a mistletoe branch, and he tricked Baldur's blind brother into hurling it at his brother. As the mistletoe shaft flew through the air, Loki guided it toward Baldur's heart, and Baldur died. As a mark of his grief, Baldur's father Odin placed the golden arm ring Draupnir on Baldur's funeral pyre, and the ring traveled with Baldur to the realm of the dead. Odin sends the god Hermod, another one of his sons, to plead with Hel, the goddess of death, to release Baldur and to return him back to life. The goddess agrees, but only if every single living creature on earth mourns for Baldur. And every creature does grieve for Baldur except for Loki, who takes the form of an old woman and refuses. As a result, Baldur can't be restored to life, and he's confined to the realm of the dead. At that point, he gives the golden arm ring to his brother Hermod as a token of love to return to their father Odin. In this story, Draupnir doesn't serve any real practical function. It doesn't allow anyone to complete a task. Instead, the magic arm ring is a physical memento of the love between Odin and Baldur, between father and son, a love that transcends even death. Another story about Draupnir is told in the sayings of Skirnir, a kind of poetic drama included in the famous Poetic Edda. The manuscript that includes this story dates back to the 13th century, and some scholars believe that the story it records was performed like a play. According to the story, one day, the god Freyr looked down from the realm of the gods into the realm of the giants. He saw a beautiful girl, Gerd, the daughter of a giant, and Freyr immediately fell in love. But he despaired because he believed he could never have her. His servant, Skirnir, discovered why his master was so depressed, and so he set out to win the girl's heart for Freyr. He journeyed to the land of the giants, and he wooed her with rare gifts on Freyr's behalf. One of those gifts was Draupnir. Unfortunately, Gerd refuses the gifts, and eventually Skirnir has to resort to threats to obtain Gerd for his master. Skirnir threatens to cut off Gerd's head with the following words: "See you, maiden, this keen, bright sword that I hold here in my hand? Before its blade the old giant bends. Your father is doomed to die. I strike you, maiden, with my sword to subdue you to act according to my will. You shall go where never again the sons of men will see you." Where gifts fail, threats succeed, and Gerd goes with him. In this story, Draupnir isn't even successful at wooing a young maiden, but it is used as an expression of a god's devotion. Draupnir isn't the only ring in Norse mythology. In addition to the stories about Draupnir, Norse mythology includes a whole cycle of stories focused on Andvarnaut, best translated as Andvari's gift. This title refers somewhat ironically to a ring, now worn on the finger this time, not the arm. But in this case, the ring is more than a memento. It takes on great power. The story cycle focused on this ring is told in the Volsunga saga, a legendary story dating to the late 13th century, describing the rise and the fall of the great Volsung clan. Near the beginning of the epic, the patriarch, Sigmund, is killed in battle, and his widow gives birth to his son, Sigurd, only after the father has died, leaving only fragments of his shattered battle sword to his son. This story, of course, is the basis for Wagner's famous ring cycle, but there are some significant differences. So if you know Wagner's masterpiece, don't be surprised if some of the elements I'm about to describe in the Volsunga saga don't sound familiar. The widow is then remarried to King Alf. The king sends his stepson away to be raised by a kind of foster father named Regin, although Sigurd is aware of his true parentage. Now, Regin is a greedy man, and he tries to use Sigurd to acquire great wealth. Regin tells Sigurd his own family story in order to draw him in. Regin's father was a magician named Hreidmar. Regin had two brothers, Otter and Fafnir, both of whom had acquired some of their father's magical powers. They were able to take on animal forms. Otter had the ability to transform into an otter. That's where we get the name. And he would often swim under a waterfall. Under that waterfall lived the dwarf Andvari. Andvari also had the ability to transform himself, and he would often take the form of a fish and swim in the same pool of water as Otter. One day, Loki visited this pool of water, and he killed an otter that he saw swimming in the pool, thinking that he would sell its pelt. Not knowing that he had actually killed the son otter in animal form, Loki brought the pelt to the magician Hreidmar's home. Otter's father and brothers recognized the pelt, and they became angry, demanding restitution for his death. They demanded that Loki cover the entire otter pelt with gold, so that not a single hair remained uncovered. In order to fulfill this demand, Loki needed gold, and he didn't have any. So he devised a plan. Loki convinced the sea giantess Ran to loan him her magic fishing net. Then he went out and caught Andvari when the dwarf had taken on the form of a fish. In order to be released, Andvari, who had accumulated great wealth with the help of a magical ring he owned, known as Andvaranat, agreed to give up all his gold. However, Loki took Andvari's ring as well, which was not part of the deal, and as punishment, Andvari cursed the ring so that anyone who owned it would die. Loki returned to Otter's family. He began to cover the otter's pelt with gold, using the gold he had taken from Andvari. Coin by coin, he laid the gold on the pelt, and at last he had used up all the gold pieces, but there was one single whisker on the pelt that remained uncovered. Otter's family demanded that Loki fulfill his pledge entirely, and reluctantly, he used Andvari's ring to complete the task, covering up the entire otter pelt. Otter's family became the ring's new owners. Now the ring began to work its curse. Fafnir, the other son of Hreidmar, who was able to change himself into an animal, began to crave the ring. He wanted the ring, but officially it belonged to his father. Eventually, Fafnir became so obsessed that he murdered his father and took the ring for himself. He then transformed himself into a dragon so that he could protect the ring, and he refused to share the ring with his other brother, Regin. Now remember, in the Volsung saga, this entire story is being told to Sigurd by Regin, his greedy foster parent. Upon hearing everything that had happened, Sigurd agrees to go after the ring on Regin's behalf, but he demands a sword. Regin makes sword after sword, but they all shatter when Sigurd tests them. Finally, Regin crafts a sword out of the shattered pieces of Sigurd's true father's sword, the one that Sigmund had left for his son. This sword, named Gram, not only doesn't shatter when Sigurd tests it, it actually slices through the iron anvil. Regin then instructs Sigurd how best to kill Fafnir, who has taken the form of a dragon to guard the ring. Regin tells Sigurd to dig a pit, to get into it, and to wait for Fafnir to walk over it. and then to thrust his sword directly up into Fafnir's throat, and Sigurd agrees. On his journey to the dragon, however, Sigurd meets Odin disguised in his wanderer form. Odin tells Sigurd to dig some trenches alongside the pit so that the dragon's blood will drain away from Sigurd. Because it turns out that Regin had left out one crucial detail. The blood of the dragon is deadly, and it would have killed Sigurd when he stabbed the dragon. Regin's plan had been for both his brother and Sigurd to die, leaving him alone with the ring. Sigurd follows Odin's advice. He successfully kills Fafnir in his dragon form. One drop of blood falls on his tongue, burning it, but also bestowing upon Sigurd the gift of prophecy. Sigurd retrieves the ring, but instead of returning it to Regin, he beheads Regin. At this point, Sigurd is freed from his evil foster father, he's armed with his own father's restored sword, and he's entrusted with Andvari's ring. He sets forth at this point as a grown man, a successful warrior, and the son of a king. He then rescues Brunhild, with whom he falls in love. Brunhild is a shield maiden, a woman who has chosen to take up arms and fight. She's also a Valkyrie, a female character who determines who will die in battle and who will live. According to the myth, Brunhild had once decided a battle in favor of Odin's enemy. In retribution, Odin condemned Brunhild to live as a mortal woman, kept in a castle and surrounded by a ring of fire until someone came to rescue her. Sigurd rescues Brunhild by entering the castle, removing her helmet to awaken her, and cutting off her armor. Now, there are some potentially interesting sexual and gender role metaphors going on here. Sigurd penetrates the castle that surrounds Brunhild. He awakens her from her sleep and removes both her helmet, perhaps representing a sexual awakening, and her armor, a concrete symbol of her taking on a man's role. So Brunhild is now ready to act as a socially acceptable woman. Brunhild pledges her love to Sigurd, but she prophesies that they will never marry. Sigurd then continues his travels, and he ends up at the court of Giuki, the king of Burgundy, and his wife Grimhild, a sorceress. Grimhild finds out that Sigurd has Andvari's ring, and she wants it for herself. She also wants Sigurd to marry her daughter Gudrun. Grimhild makes up a special drink called the Ale of Forgetfulness. And when Sigurd drinks it, he forgets all about Brunhild, and he marries Gudrun. Later, Grimhild tricks Brunhild into marrying one of her sons. Eventually, Brunhild discovers the deception, but at that point, it's too late for her ever to marry Sigurd. At this point, various family members turn on one another. Sigurd is killed by one of his wife's brothers, and Brunhild, devastated by grief, builds a funeral pyre for Sigurd and kills herself in the flames. So what happens to the ring? We're never actually told. After all this pain, Brunhild's widower decides to return all of Andvari's gold back to him. He travels to Andvari's cave under the waterfall and leaves the gold there. Eventually, Andvari discovers it, but he never finds the ring. It's lost to him and to history. The Norse stories of the ring have fascinated audiences for thousands of years. And for the opera lovers out there, you'll have seen how Richard Wagner based his opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung, on this story. But there are a number of changes to the original story. In the opera, there's no character named Andvari. Instead, there's a dwarf named Alberich, and he crafts his ring from gold found in the Rhine River. Sigurd becomes the lead character, Siegfried, but the overall storyline is still very similar. If you're not an opera fan, some of the storylines centered on the ring probably resonate with you for other reasons. A lot of material from the Draupnir and Andvari myth traditions appear in J.R.R. Tolkien's works, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien, a trained classicist, drew from lots of mythological traditions, especially Celtic and Norse mythology, when he developed the storyline for his novels. For our purposes, the storyline focused on the ring is intriguing. Tolkien's ring carries its own kind of curse. Over time, anyone who wears it or who attempts to use it for his own gain falls under the power of the ring. And with each use, the person carrying the ring becomes more and more of a slave to it. Both Frodo and Bilbo, the hobbits who take possession of the ring, suffer tremendously as a consequence of carrying it, especially Frodo, who carries it to Mount Doom in an attempt to destroy it. However, the creature Gollum most closely resembles one of the original Norse story characters. Remember that Andvari lives in a cave under a waterfall, and he often takes the form of a fish. Gollum murders his own brother in order to acquire the ring, and it drives him to live underground in a dark cave near where Bilbo takes it from him. Also, in both the Andvari mythology and Tolkien's novels, the ring's cycle of destruction is brought to an end by someone who doesn't desire the ring for himself. Sigurd obtains Andvari's ring on behalf of Regin. He never coveted it for himself. Frodo is similar. Both Sigurd and Frodo suffer as ring bearers, but they are also instrumental in breaking the ring's destructive power over others. And of course, some of Tolkien's characters seem to come straight out of the Andvari ring stories. As I mentioned, Odin in his wanderer persona reappears as Gandalf. Tolkien explicitly refers to the fact that he drew on Odin. In addition, Tolkien's novels draw on the Norse tradition of contests, wagers, and even riddles. Remember last lecture when we talked about Odin's test of the wise giant Vafthrudnir, in which Odin asked the giant 3 questions. Tolkien picks up on this with Gollum and Bilbo's riddles. In fact, an exchange of riddles is how Bilbo ends up escaping from Gollum with the powerful ring. Norse mythology, along with other myths, includes lots of wagers, riddles, and skill challenges. And these stories often involve a twist, like when Loki agrees to yield his head, but makes it clear that he never agreed to lose any part of his neck. What makes the Norse mythology of 1,000 years ago so captivating today? Part of the answer is that Norse mythology touches on basic human desires. Desires for wealth, for love, for power, for sex, even for some kind of contact with the magical and the transcendent. Norse mythology originated in a harsh world where local tribes fought for control of land and resources. Christianity arrived relatively late to these lands, securing a foothold in the 10th and 11th centuries. With Christianity's arrival, local practices and mythologies centered on Norse gods were prohibited. The manuscripts that survive today may have been written to document this lost local Norse tradition. Older material known as oral stories, poetry, and ballads were blended with new material. The manuscripts we have celebrate gods, heroes, and magical beings, continually battling giants, dragons, and other dark forces. The details may differ, but stories of goodness struggling against evil, for hammers or rings that can provide magical protection from attack and death, still speak to the audiences of a millennium later. We come now to the conclusion of ancient Greek, Roman, and ancient European myths. It's fitting that we end this course with a look at rings in the Norse tradition, because virtually everything we say about these rings can be applied to countless other items in the great mythological traditions we've explored. In ancient mythologies, personal items often become characters in and of themselves. They have names, and often they have magical powers. In some cases, they drive an entire storyline. There really is no Volsunga saga without Andvari's ring. Odin and Freyr and Thor wouldn't be the same without their spear, sailing ship, and hammer. There's no Jason without his golden fleece, or the Dagda without his harp. Yet most of us don't believe in a spear that guides itself, or in a ship that fluctuates in size, or in a hammer that can't be destroyed. We don't believe it's worth sailing the seas in search of a golden fleece, and we don't believe that a single strum of a harp can bring an entire army to its knees. But it's obvious that things with magical powers still fascinate us, despite the fact that we claim to live in a rational, empirical age. So what kind of hold do rings and other magical things have on us? On one level, I suspect that we still enjoy the fantasy. I, for one, would love it if my car drove itself home all on its own each day, flying above the Atlanta commuter traffic and depositing me in my driveway. Just knowing that I would never experience a fender bender or make a wrong turn would make my day. We can all imagine just how useful one magical item in our lives could be. But I also think it's more than just utility that stokes this fantasy. When we see the Dagda's harp on a pint of Guinness, we don't just think about defeating armies. Draupnir's arm ring dripped golden rings every 9 days, but the stories about this magical arm ring don't focus on the gold. They focus on the ring as a deeply personal item, given from father to son, and then returned once again. The harp evokes Celtic pride, just broadly speaking. Certain items become part of us. They reflect who we are, and they can be displayed to the world or shared with loved ones. That's part of why certain cultures bury personal items with their dead, not for utility's sake, but because the items are intimately bound up with the individuals who use them. They become a kind of extension of an individual's personality. The Norse mythmakers understood that. Ships and spears, hammers and rings, they provide a kind of shorthand for who a god is, and we still do that today. Think about your own possessions. What's the one item you own that is associated with you or with a family member? Special possessions become bound up with individual people's stories. For the women in my family, my grandmother's necklace is like this. We're careful to pass this necklace from generation to generation, partly to remember her, partly to bind ourselves to her, and partly because we have this vague sense that we're somehow more protected when we wear it. Now, I don't actually believe that the necklace has magical powers, but I can't help think that something of my grandmother and my mother rubbed off on the necklace, and I carry that with me when I wear it. The great mythologies understand this. They understand the power of special objects in our lives. Although we've discussed many different myths and several cultures in this course, it's hard not to feel that we've just barely scratched the surface. There's lots more to tell. At another level, though, we've laid a foundation here that will enable you to explore ancient Greek, Roman, and European myth traditions further for yourself. These myths have contributed significantly to Western literature. I'd even suggest that they've established the themes, characters, and tropes that we find over and over in subsequent literature. More importantly, they disclose, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, the concerns that lay at the forefront of their home communities. These myth traditions were shaped over centuries as communities organized by tribes were shifting toward larger affiliations. Spartans and Trojans transitioned into Greeks, and men and women of the House of Ulster became Irish. Local and kinship loyalties didn't disappear, they're preserved for us in the ancient myths. In addition, these particular myth traditions took shape while these communities experienced dramatic shifts in religion, economic structures, political institutions, military dominance, and social thinking. As we've seen, these mythologies explore social, historical, and philosophical challenges that we know their home communities were struggling with. Certain bodies of myths offered context, direction, and purpose for aspects of human life in the ancient world, and they promised that human life had value. In some cases, mythologies jumped cultures, and they became an interesting bridge between different communities. Think back to Roman mythology's roots in Greek mythology. Unlike most concrete cultural artifacts, such as monuments or statues, myths are fluid, they're nimble, they can change to reflect a new cultural home. Like a fine wine, a robust myth tradition ages well, developing deep notes and complex flavors. Or to use a different metaphor, rich myth traditions are like the land under an important historical site. Careful archaeology reveals layer after layer of human experience, reflecting everything from a king's lofty dreams to a common woman's daily routine. Thank you for joining me in this extended dig into layers of Western mythology. I hope this series inspires you to continue exploring.